Welcome to this issue of Discovering Truth at the Movies. Hi, my name is David Lance. In this final episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, Auntie Dr. Sarah picks the children up to take them home. Isaiah and his siblings tell her all about the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And then she gives Isaiah some advice about girl psychology and a possible reason why Mary took his Bible in the first place. Using a scene from The Princess Bride, I'll ask a question for reflection as I give a personal story at the end of the episode. The Chronicles of Belteshazzar is about a boy who learned how Daniel lived by faith instead of cowering in fear. You can find the Chronicles for Belteshazzar are on sale at Amazon.com, and you can also learn more about it on my website at wisejargon.com/chronicles. Well, without further ado, let's look at chapter 24, the final chapter about questions. Wave goodbye to Nai and Grandpa, said Auntie Dr. Sarah. The four children yelled and waved to their grandparents as Auntie Dr. Sarah backed the car out of her parents' driveway. The two waved goodbyes to their grandchildren as she slowly turned the corner to begin to exit the neighborhood. She would have the kids for the next hour as she drove them home to her brother and sister-in-law's house. Beside her sat Isaiah, while the younger three sat in the back seat. Only Hope required a booster seat. My, how the laws about car seats had changed since she was a child, Sarah thought. She'd borrowed this one from her brother Jason, as she seldom had need to drive the children. It was so good to have them around so she could spend time with them. Sarah looked at Isaiah and asked, "Well, did you get your questions about separation between church and state answered?" She returned her attention to the road as she awaited her nephew's response. "Yes, I did. I know a whole lot more than I did before." Isaiah squirmed a little in his seat and then asked a question that he'd been wrestling with. "Do you think I ought to ask Mary about what I learned?" "Depends on how you do it," replied his aunt. "Do you plan to do it in a mean way or as a way to start up a conversation with her?" "Well, I don't want to be mean about it. How do you think I should bring it up?" Auntie Dr. Sarah smiled and said with a wink, "Sometimes girls do what Mary did because they actually like the boy they're teasing. So this might be a way for you to get to know her better. You might start by telling her that you'd done some thinking about what she said, but now she might have totally forgotten about the topic. So she might ask you what you mean, and then you can say that if she'll let you buy her a Coke at McDonald's, you can tell her what you learned about separation between church and state, and maybe even about the story about Daniel." "Isaiah's got a girlfriend. Isaiah's got a girlfriend," Nadia started chanting from the back seat. Isaiah turned a little red at his sister's taunting, but before the other children could chime in, Auntie Dr. Sarah interrupted and said, "Isaiah's just going to find a way to share what he learned and make a new friend. Now, what about the rest of you? Tell me all about your weekend with Nai and Grandpa. Did you have fun? Did Grandpa tell you stories?" Hope spoke first. "Nai played with me and read me books while Grandpa told stories to the big kids. I got tired of listening to him." "She also made us popcorn and we had some ice cream," added Josiah. "I stayed up with Isaiah and Nadia to listen to Grandpa, but then I got tired and fell asleep." Nadia chimed in. "There weren't many girls in his story, but one of them was a woman named Timnah. She was one of Daniel's enemies at first, but then she realized that he wasn't bad like she thought he was. In the end, she decided to help Daniel and Naaman. But I'm not sure that what happened because I finally fell asleep during the part of Grandpa's story. Well, I stayed awake for the whole thing. And once Nai, Nadia, and Josiah were asleep, Grandpa and I went out into the kitchen to have a snack and finish the story." Isaiah paused for a moment, and then he asked, "Auntie Dr. Sarah, do you think Timnah was a real person?" "Humph," responded his aunt. "Absolutely not. Timnah is a fictional character. Grandpa came up with her name because that's the name of the town where Samson's first wife came from." "I thought Samson's wife was named Delilah." That was the name of Samson's second wife, Isaiah. Any doctor, Sarah paused to check traffic patterns as she merged into traffic on I-70 off the interstate highway ramp. Samson's first wife was also a Philistine, and she came from a town called Timnah, not far from the ancient Philistine city of Ashkelon. And do you know who Grandpa based Timnah's appearance on, so that she would look, so that he would know what kind of woman she looked like? I'll bet it was you, chimed in Nadia from the back seat. You're right, Nadia. And let me tell you, I was not happy with your grandpa when I found that out. I didn't like the idea of having a devious, scheming, evil woman based on me, even if she wasn't a real person. But in the end, she turned out to be a brave woman who did the right thing, just like you always do. Sarah looked at Isaiah and lightened up as she saw the sincere look on his face. Coughing slightly, she nodded her head and then said, anything else you all had questions about from Grandpa's story? Isaiah scrunched up his eyes as he thought about the question he wanted to ask. At the end of the story, Daniel had a meeting with some of his friends in a building that looks like a pyramid. It's called a ziggurat. Daniel talked about a group he called the Brotherhood of the Scroll that would protect and preserve the ancient scrolls that had been written by the prophets like Isaiah. Was the Brotherhood of the Scroll a real group? Annie Dr. Sarah laughed. The Brotherhood of the Scroll is a novel Grandpa wrote back in the late 1990s. The story you heard him tell is what is called an abbreviated version of that book. While the group of Daniel and his friends is fictional, we know that somebody had to have preserved all the writings of the ancient Hebrews. Whether it was Daniel and his friends or some other group of unknown Hebrews that preserved the ancient scrolls and made copies of them, I don't know. I didn't know Grandpa had written other books. That's cool. Isaiah paused for a few seconds to gather his thoughts and then asked one more question. Okay, there was this other guy that Daniel talked about in the story, a boy by the name of Cyrus. In the story, Daniel said that he had predicted when the next eclipse of the sun would be and that the eclipse would happen when this Cyrus kid turned 15 years old. Was this Cyrus guy a real person? And was Daniel actually good enough at astronomy that he could predict things like when an eclipse would happen? Sarah thought for a few moments. Astronomy was not something she knew a lot about, but then she remembered that the Babylonian Magi had been expert astronomers. After gathering her thoughts, she said to Isaiah, well, you remember that Nebuchadnezzar put Daniel in charge of all the wise men. They were called the Magi. Yes, I remember, said Isaiah. So whether it was Daniel or one of the Magi who worked for him, it's very likely that they could have predicted when the next total eclipse of the sun would happen. Now, I remember Grandpa telling me about a famous battle that was fought in central Turkey in a place called Cappadocia. At the mention of Cappadocia, Nadia piped up. Hey, we visited Cappadocia back when Dad was working as a missionary in Turkey. That was really cool. They have lots of hot air balloons that you can go up in the air and look down on these rock houses that are called, what are they called, Isaiah? They're called fairy chimneys. They were created by a huge ancient volcano like 1,000,000 years ago. Well, kids, it looks like you are way ahead of me on this subject. But getting back to your question, Isaiah, when there was a battle that was fought there in the central part of what is now modern Turkey, you know what the battle was called? Nope, replied Isaiah and waited for his aunt to tell him. Well, she said, it was called the Battle of the Eclipse. The Battle of the Eclipse, said Josiah, like the kind of battle you fight with swords and chariots? Tell us about it, Andy, Dr. Sarah. Please, please, please. Sarah laughed at Josiah's pleading request. Sorry, I can't do that. I've told you all I know. You'll just have to ask Grandpa about that the next time you go see him. Well, I can't wait that long. I'm going to use Dad's computer to Google it as soon as we get home. And with that, Isaiah stopped asking questions and looked out the window, wishing that the car would go faster. And now the prologue. Isaiah walked the school hallway, his destination in plain sight. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the incident. Would she remember? Good. Her locker was open and the door facing him. He snuck up right up so he'd be standing there when she shut it. Isaiah stepped into position, checked his hair, and waited. The locker door shut. "Hi, Mary," Isaiah said before she could say something snarky. She looked at him with her big brown eyes, her long brown hair tied in a single braid hanging almost to her waist. He stood a good 3 inches taller than her, and she seemed frozen looking up at him. Isaiah didn't waste any time and said, "I figured out some things about what you said the other day." Mary blinked at him twice. What? What are you talking about, Isaiah? She finally stammered out. Isaiah grew more confident, and this was going to be better than he had hoped. "Oh, the other day you grabbed my Gideon's Bible out of my hand. And when I started chasing you, you threw it in some bushes and yelled, 'Separation between church and state.'" "Oh, that," Mary replied. And then, with more fire in her eyes, she tilted her head and looked up at him and said, "So what does it mean, Mr. Smarty Pants? Did you have to Google it?" Mary folded her arms as she held a copy of The Hunger Games in that she was reading. Isaiah shook his head. "Nope, better than that. My grandpa told me about it when he explained the Chronicles of Belteshazzar." "The Chronicles of who? Belteshazzar Carnival?" "Belteshazzar." Isaiah struggled to not let himself get upset. "That was the Babylonian name of Daniel. The Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel from the Bible." Isaiah was quickly losing his confidence. Maybe Auntie Dr. Sarah had been wrong after all. Mary's eyes lit up and the freckles on her face became swallowed up in the creases of her mischievous smile. "Does your grandpa tell interesting stories?" Isaiah grinned. "Oh, yeah. There's sword fighting, secret coded messages, stories of ancient gods, and even some romance." "Not a lot, but some. If you like, I can tell it to you over a Coke or something." This was the moment of truth. What would she say? Mary closed and locked her locker. Turning her head to look at him over her shoulder, she said, "I'll meet you at the soda shop after school, and you can buy me a milkshake and tell me about it. Deal?" "Deal," said Isaiah. Mary waved and turned the other direction and headed off to class. Isaiah stood there and wondered to himself, did he have enough money in his wallet for a milkshake? And now the epilogue. "That was some story, Isaiah." Mary grabbed her bag from where it lay against the park bench where they had been sitting. They had begun the story at the soda shop, but finished their milkshake several hours ago and had walked to the local park. "Let's walk home. I live that way." She pointed in the direction of her house. They had walked for half a block when Mary asked, "Is your grandfather going to tell you more stories? It sounds like that Cyrus guy who was prophesied about was a mysterious person." Isaiah shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know, but I can ask him next time I see him." Mary nodded and then asked a different question. "So, did you look up that Battle of the Eclipse?" Isaiah smiled and laughed. "Of course. It was fought during the full eclipse of the sun. The two kingdoms fought the battle in what is today the country of Turkey. They decided the eclipse was some sort of sign from the gods that they should stop fighting each other and make peace." Isaiah hesitated and then continued. "History records that two observers from Babylon came and watched the battle. Evidently, their astronomers had predicted right when the eclipse would happen. They had the prince and the princess of the two countries marry each other to end the war." Mary smiled, nodded, and then looking up at Isaiah said, "Wouldn't it be crazy if Daniel was one of the Babylonians who went to where the battle was fought to negotiate the peace? Do you think he did that?" Isaiah shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know. Anything's possible, I guess." They kept walking, making small talk about school, and then Mary said, "This is my house. Bend down. I want to tell you a secret of my own." Isaiah, a frown of confusion contorting his face, bent down as Mary tugged his ear close to her lips. "Your aunt was right." She kissed him on the cheek and quickly went inside the house. Isaiah paused a moment, turned, and started running, grinning all the way home. And now I'd like to take a moment for a personal reflection. Years ago, when I was a freshman at Butler University, I took an Old Testament literature course as an elective. That and an astronomy class I also took as an elective By the way, Butler does have a small observatory there on campus. Are two of the best classes I ever took. Isaiah's conversation with Auntie Dr. Sarah about the Battle of the Eclipse introduces the reader to the opening of my second novel, The Sword of the Scroll, which is available as a Kindle book. In that novel, I got to apply my love of astronomy by telling a tale that provides a biblical analysis of the constellations in talking about spiritual warfare in the heavenly realms. That novel begins with a battle between two warriors in what was in ancient times known as the land of Gomer. The battle ended with the sudden appearance of a full eclipse of the sun. Fought in May of 585 BC in what is today part of central Turkey, I introduced the reader to the fascinating land of Cappadocia and its famed fairy chimneys. My son Jason and his family lived in Ankara, Turkey for 18 months. We went to visit them in June of 2019 and were able to take a trip to Cappadocia, where we got to walk through the underground city of Kemikili, as well as several third-century churches that had been built into the rock formations. A part of the readings in my Old Testament literature class, my professor had us read a novel by James Michener called The Source. The novel is set at an archaeological dig in Israel, where the layers of the tell begin with the time of Abraham at the bottom of the dig and conclude with the time of Paul near the upper surface. As the archaeologists work through the layers of the dig, Michener transports his readers to the time of the patriarchs, giving you a glimpse of what life must have been like back in Bible times. The Source inspired me to think about how to share the truths of the Bible through the telling of historical Christian fiction. Several years after writing my novel, The Brotherhood of the Scroll, in 1999, I reread Michener's book and was reminded that he also created a female character named Timnah after the Philistine city that was the home of Samson's first wife. In this last chapter, Auntie Dr. Sarah makes a final appearance to give Isaiah some advice on dealing with the girl, Mary. After finishing the chapter and having her suggest that sometimes girls behave the way Mary did, I came up with the idea for the prologue and the epilogue. I felt it was a great finishing touch, something that Grandpa and the Princess Bride would have appreciated with his story of how Wesley and Princess Buttercup reconnected after having spent years apart. The theme of the movie is captured in a scene in which Miracle Masks asks a question of Wesley and gets this response. What you got there that's worth living for? True love. And so this leads to my last question for reflection. What are the stories of your life that you can tell your kids and grandkids that shows them how much you love them? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this particular episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. I want to encourage you to go to my website at wisejargon.com/@the-movies to learn about my newsletter series, Conversations with the Culture. And don't forget, you can go to Amazon.com and order the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. It's available as a paperback, as a Kindle, and as a hardback copy. Well, until next time, thanks so much, and God bless.